am really grateful and flattered and pleased to have been asked to give this lecture, but I have been intimidated by the prospect of doing so, as it's the first lecture I've given since before COVID. My personal circumstances, which I won't go into, have led me to accept constraints on my engagement in such activities. But today I've bitten the bullet and I'm going to give it a go. And I appeal to your sympathies if I stumble along the way. Sorry to say, in the old days, for an hour's lecture, I don't think it will be quite an hour, it depends how fast I speak. I used to consider a page of scribbled notes was enough to get me by. But today I'm relying upon a full script, which I don't like because it means less by way of informality and quality of oral presentation. So please bear with me as I do my best in these circumstances. On the way here, I did think about, have I ever given a named lecture before? So far, and then I thought, yes, actually I have. And one I think was about 10 years ago was the Alex Cairncross lecture. I can explain who, I don't know if people know, people from our generation will know who he was because he wrote a leading textbook, which would now be considered a complete waste of time. But basically, he was an applied economist, economic historian, policymaker, etc., etc. And then the only other one that I can recall doing with a named lecture was at Highgate Cemetery for Karl Marx on the 201st anniversary of his birth. I didn't get the 200th, that went to Tariq Ali, I'm afraid. So I don't think I could have trumped that. Anyway, I begin with this picture of Spindletop in 1901, the major impetus behind the Texas oil industry, and as it says on the caption, changed the history of America and the world. But what I really want to show you is what happened later. That's 2 years later. 2 years later. I think we can agree that there is an excess of Spindletops, not least as the more Spindletops there are, this is well known within the oil industry, the less is the pressure which releases the oil out of the ground, because the more holes you make in a balloon, the less pressure you get to release. Quite apart from the replication of the overheads. I mean, literally, replication. And so what's happening here, everyone's trying to get their bit of oil out from under the ground. Now I'm going to give you another example. This is a surface map of the Kimberley mine in South Africa, a huge vertical pipe in which diamonds were to be found in what is appropriately called kimberlite. And each of those little squares is a mine for digging out diamonds. Each a separately owned claim, exclusively to whites. The mine became dubbed the Big Hole for obvious reasons, and it was the biggest hole. It was half a kilometer wide, 42 acres in surface area. Mining went down a kilometer, and it is the biggest hole in the world ever excavated by hand, to a depth of over 200 meters. Sorry, I said a kilometer. Bear in mind, I mean, this is just bear in mind that each of those claims I had photographs of this, but enough's enough, was worked by a system of ropes connected to the sides. Each one had its own set of ropes and pulleys, so that people could take their little cart down into their little place where they could dig. And so the mines were worked by ropes slung across holes on pillars to allow a small platform to descend where the clone could be worked out. As I'm trying to make the perhaps point is, it's Spindletop all over again, only much more knotty, literally. Now, each of these dysfunctions did get resolved, interestingly, through the control of distribution of the product rather than directly at the level of production. So we're talking here Ernest Oppenheimer in the case of De Beers, who actually gained a monopoly through control of distribution of diamonds, not the production of diamonds. And of course, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, again, didn't control the production of oil, but he did control the distribution of oil. And that's the way in which some of these things, and we're talking about well-rewarded people here. Ernest Oppenheimer was the founder of De Beers, and also actually also Anglo-American, and almost at one point 80% of all the shares on the South African Stock Exchange. He was succeeded by Harry Oppenheimer, who didn't have children to inherit, but did have a nephew, who's Nicky, who I actually had dinner with on one occasion. And he's valued at $10 billion at the moment, and actually he doesn't run anything, to be honest. I have a third example, the British coal industry, for which I don't have any pictures. Oh, how did that happen? Go away. That was too soon. On which I've worked excessively, which by the interwar period, between the First and Second World War, was heavily breaching the boundaries of surface ownership, heavily concentrated ownership of land in this country. So British coal could get going, you could extract the coal within the confines of a single estate, and that wouldn't cause any problems. But as you can see, once your mines get bigger and once you start taking the coal out, you're going to spread over to the coal, the underland of other estates. And in British law, actually not anywhere else in the world, with the exception of America, the ownership of the coal remained with the owner of the surface. And as you can imagine, as you start expanding the mines, as you start making them bigger and work out the mines, you're going to start going across other people's boundaries. So these pictures here are essentially being reproduced in the British case, but on a huge geographical scale rather than. And what this led to in the interwar period was a limitation on mine size, but also limitation on mechanization. So again, excess, once again, in fragmented, inefficient excess in proliferation of the number of mines confined within a particular estate. And this was only resolved by nationalization in 1947, when the industry actually became the most successful in Europe. But note the royalties, which is the ownership of the coal, no pictures of the coal under the land, was nationalized in 1938 by a Tory government. So recognized was it that the ownership of the coal under the ground by those who owned the surface was such a barrier to the development of the industry. And £68 million was paid in recognition for the need to consolidate all these fragmented and excessive number of leases. That's about £1 billion in today's money. So it's not the biggest owners. There are about 30,000 claims for coal under the ground. The biggest owners were the church. I collected all this data from all of the records of compensation. And the biggest owners were the church and some fellow called H.M. King. I couldn't work out who this H.M. King person was who owned so much coal. And then I Ron twigged straight away, as you probably have. And then that allowed me to consolidate H.M. King with the Crown, because of course the church and the Crown are the two largest landowners in this country. So what I'm illustrating here is excessive fragmentation and development of production units in the context of landed property. And in doing so, I'm indulging myself in work of over 30 or 40 years ago, just to put the issue of excess on the agenda. As I'm not going to bring up these examples again, but I like them so much, I thought I'd share them with you. Of course, mainstream economics would have a lot of ways of explaining these outcomes, not least through market imperfections, whether as externalities, lack of or incomplete property rights, presence of transaction costs, increasing returns to scale, path dependence, and so on. There are all sorts of explanations you can use. The deficiencies in these explanations are not my concern today, although they do not begin to get to grips with the issues of the class, power, and vested interests and how they play out and are transformed. Instead, what I want to emphasize today is the political economy of excess arising out of capitalism more generally and systemically. And I will do so by drawing upon some rather different examples from my work. And you'll be pleased to know a little bit more recent, perhaps. The first is the political economy of food, on which I worked intensively in the 1990s. While I was still at Birkbeck, as part of a major research program on the UK's nation's diet, after which I served on the newly founded Social Science Research Committee of the Food Standards Agency for 10 years. That's another story, not least as I chaired its subcommittee on slaughterhouse controls when the horse meat scandal broke. They soon got rid of me when that happened. More important people had to deal with that. But the political economy of excess is unavoidable in the case of food because of what I have termed the diseases of affluence, not least the rise of obesity. In 1969, President Nixon convened a conference to deal with high levels of nutrition, one result of which was being the failure to be able to recruit enough military for the Vietnam War. This commission made 1,800 specific recommendations on how it should be dealt with, 1,650 of which were implemented. And so they had an anniversary conference 50 years later. But it was not marked by celebration. The reason for this is as follows. I'll quote from the report. Today, half a century later, the US faces a very different set of nutrition challenges. Epidemics of diet-related obesity, diabetes, and other chronic diseases, widening disparities in food access and affordability, food insecurity, tremendous stresses to the environment, including threats to soils, waterways, oceans, and climate. The burden of chronic illness reduces quality of life and life expectancy for millions of Americans and results in healthcare costs that are placing unprecedented strains on the budgets of federal, state, and local governments, businesses, and families. Warming to that same theme again, overweight and obesity are threatening our national security by disqualifying young men and women from military service. So now it's gone, not the Boer War, these ricket recruits cannot serve. It's now obesity and the associated diseases that are the problem. Meanwhile, environmental degradation caused by global food production is exacerbating climate change and depleting natural resources. And nor is, as I said, the potential for war nor pandemic off the agenda. Obesity is affecting national security in the US, with 71% of young people between the ages of 17 and 24, 71% failing to qualify for military service. These ineligibility rates are a major reason why the US Army has not been on track to meet annual recruitment goals. Poor diet is now the leading cause of poor health in the US, causing more than 500,000 deaths per year. The prevalence of obesity has risen sharply from 15% of adults and 5.5% of children in 1980 to 39.8% of adults and nearly 20% of children in 2016. More than 100 million Americans, nearly half of all US adults, suffer from diabetes or pre-diabetes, while 1 in 3 US children born after 2000 is expected to develop type 2 diabetes. I mean, this is extraordinary. Cardiovascular disease afflicts about 122 million people and causes 840,000 deaths each year, and so on and so on. And for the first time in American history, life expectancies are falling, with declines for 3 consecutive years due in part to significant increases in midlife mortality from diet-related diseases. That's the incidence of this, can I say, excess? But what about economic costs? The economic costs of this new national nutrition crisis are staggering. Total US healthcare expenditure has risen from 6.9% of GDP to 18% in 2017. These rising medical costs, dominated by diet-related chronic health conditions, are crushing government budgets and private business growth. Total direct healthcare and indirect economic costs for cardiovascular diseases are estimated at $316 billion per year. For diabetes, $327 billion a year. And for all such related diseases, $1.72 trillion. These amounts dwarf the annual budgets of many federal agencies, including the budgets of the Departments of Agriculture, Education, Homeland Security, and Justice. That's enough of that. You know, I don't want to depress you anymore. Oh, yes, I do. Nor are these stats confined to the US. According to the WHO, worldwide obesity tripled between 1975 and 2016. Then to 39% of adults were overweight, and 13% of the world's adult population were obese. Number of obese adults in England, where we are close to home, almost doubled between 1997 and 2017. In 2018, 63% of adults were overweight or obese. A third of all children leaving school are overweight or obese. Worryingly, actually, I found this extraordinarily worrying. Economic development would appear to bring obesity itself, with China's experience particularly telling, with 1/10 of its population now suffering diabetes. Double the rate even of the UK, even though type 2 diabetes was practically unknown in China 2 decades ago. In a nutshell, across the world, malnutrition through overeating is at the point of overtaking, if not well past, levels of undernutrition. Well, I hope this is enough to convince you that some sort of a political economy of excess is involved here. Why are we literally eating ourselves to ill health and early death? Interestingly, I found an answer by accident. I had, before food, worked extensively on consumption more generally. Again, accidentally having been drawn into investigating the relationship between consumer durables as domestic labor devices and increasing female labor market participation. Do washing machines mean women can go out to work, basically, is what the thesis was. Actually, I got into this out of reading the material of someone who was applying to a job for Birkbeck, so Birkbeck's to blame for all of this. Basically, there is none, but that's, again, another story, as is the notion of a consumer revolution, which drew me into the history of consumption and its role in the Industrial Revolution, on which there is a significant literature. By historians, I was asked to contribute a paper on family and consumption for their history conference. Like a good scholar, I did a literature search, expecting to be bombarded with clothes, fashion, and the like. Far from it. The vast majority, or the big topics in the consumption and gender, were alcohol, tobacco, and food. And the latter focused on eating disorders, not primarily obesity, but anorexia and bulimia, which at the time were on the cusp of spreading from teenage girls to other categories, including even anorexia by displacement, mothers exhibiting the symptoms of proxy anorexia on behalf of their daughters. I mean, this is the Most of the literature, of course, mainly came from psychology on this. There is even an international journal of eating disorders, of which Lady Di was the patron. Here I was not going to get what I wanted, as in general, the literature focused on collections of individual studies or neuroses. Although there is a social psychology, sociology of eating disorders focusing on young women, which see it as a consequence of anxiety about meeting the stresses of adult life, and hence a bodily resistance to entering adult life so that you can resist or avoid the tensions associated with becoming a woman in modern society. What I wanted was not individual psychological studies of why this young girl is a anorexia or a bulimia. I wanted socially epidemiology, in the sense not to explain and deal with individual cases, but why this particular disease of affluence, excess, should arise exclusively as a condition of late 20th century capitalism. And the literature did give me an answer. And the answer is as follows, for it showed that what those with eating disorders are that they arise out of the consequence of individual neuroses arising most immediately out of the simultaneously derived compulsions both to eat and to diet. That was what was really a key as far as I was concerned. Why is it that we are suffering from just major systemic pressures both to eat and to diet, and each of us have to deal with all of this? My particular contribution was to add two crucial insights. First, as indicated, these are not simply individually generated compulsions, but systemic forces arising from 20th century system of food abundance. They apply to us all, not just to those who suffer so-called eating disorders. Some of us just have a bit more trouble handling them than others. Second, even if the food system dominates in promoting eating, as food has become the simplest, cheapest, and most readily available satisfier, emotional indulgence, oh, I need, etc., etc., it sits side by side with the diet industry, which has also grown in leaps and bounds. How is it that the two most popular forms of non-fiction can be cookbooks and diet books? How is it that the two most, the aim is indulgence versus the perfect body. But I must say, mine is the social epidemiology. How can it that eating and not eating can coexist with one another? Why isn't it there a battle and so on, without neutralizing one another and to whatever extent? And the answer is very, very simple. Dieting has become about eating more, not less. Maybe. The two compulsions feed one another. My own work sought to demonstrate how this materialized in practice in particular foods by looking at these from farm to plate, as well as the cultures that accompanied them in light of what was already recognized long ago, that neither price, e.g. a sugar tax, nor informational campaigns, look, come on, eat healthily, were going to work. Indeed, my research suggested they might make matters worse, and I'll explain why in a bit. By the way, this is not to deny the way in which the food system seeks to undermine such efforts, just as it did with tobacco, for example. For the latter, I used to say, unlike food, you cannot have the equivalent of a prospering of both a eat me and a don't me industry. You can't have a smoke and a non-smoke industry. That's what I used to argue. Now along comes the vape economy, improves me, well, right and wrong at the same time. But back to food. Consider, for example, what happened when the government did try to do something due to estimates children aged under 16 were exposed to 15 billion junk food adverts online in 2019 versus 700 million just 2 years earlier. Its proposal to usher in some of the toughest digital marketing restrictions in the world by the end of 2022 prompted a letter signed by 800 food and drink manufacturers and 3,000 UK brands complaining they had not been given enough time to submit detailed objections, suggesting advertisers could use sophisticated online tools to aim their advertisements at adult audiences and not children. Oh, that's okay then. This is just one indication of the power, in a small area, of the power of food corporations and the systems that underpin them, but also of a stubborn resistance to change that continues to persist along the lines of half-heartedly, well, save the children and let them become obese in adulthood instead. So shift rather than address the problem, and note the reception to recently introduced legislation to restrict online advertising is welcome, but correctly seen as deficient and compromised. Again, I'll have a little bit more on this. So what my research did was look empirically in great detail at household consumption of food from the National Household Food Survey. Take the dairy system, for example. Some of us are old enough to know how this used to work. A major chain has been the end of the monopoly of doorstep delivery. And too long ago for the young of us to remember, but it was accompanied by the ability of supermarkets to sell milk. And this led to often a loss leader on the milk, but the sale of a huge range of different types of milks, healthy milks, skim milks, semi-skim milks, yogurts, etc., none of which existed when I was a kid. But this begs the question, begs a very, very serious question. So yeah, that's wonderful. Now we can all go and get our skim milk, etc., whereas we didn't have it before because they were very product limited on those electric vans that come around with our daily. But as I said, what this does is begs the question of what happens to the cream that was in the milk. And what we found is that it became incorporated into an even more extensive range of fancy cheeses and desserts. And lo and behold, our research showed, by looking at the detailed household surveys, that those purchasing healthy milk, skim milk, semi-skim milk, were more liable to purchase the cream products than those who just bought ordinary milk. And this reflects one psychological, I said something about the cultures of eating, to the two imperatives both to eat and to diet. I had skim milk, so I can have a cream puff. Or I just drank a Diet Coke, so I can have an extra burger. All right, this is what people say. It's when, maybe some of you say this to yourselves. I don't know. Now consider the sugar system. Another one we looked at. Everyone believes they are eating less sugar, especially with the decline of home baking, despite Bake Off, which I call something else ending in off, and the drop of sugar in tea and other drinks. Yeah, there's been a big decline through health campaigns of the amount of sugar that we, I can't even find sugar in my house anymore. When the builders come, I have to, it's got some brown sugar here or whatever. People don't, it's gone. But sugar consumption per capita continues to rise. How is this? Because it's becoming an ever-increasing ingredient of ready-prepared foods. Beware, the healthy, natural ingredients that you see advertised actually have a byline with a U in, if you like. Natural, anything that says it's natural products only is almost certainly full of sugar, by the way. So just if you look at that. Together with fat, salt, air, and water. That's what they like to sell in food. And adulterated ingredients for serving or creating palatability. These are the staples of manufactured foods. And don't even start me on classic versus Diet Coke, all about how to expand, not reduce, consumption of sugary drinks. So again, here I want to make two further points. The first, other things remaining the same, at best, dietary campaigns and pricing can only redistribute what is eaten if it has been produced. They are only liable to be more successful with those that have the money and the inclination to take up alternative forms of gratification through eating, meaning that the result will be even more concentrated consumption of cheaper, lesser foods amongst those who are hard to inform and low in income. So the consequences of advertising campaigns and so on is liable to increase the consumption amongst those who probably have the worst consumption in the first place. Whilst on physical and emotional gratification, food offers the easiest and cheapest means. It is almost literally everywhere. I mean, I thought it's gone as far as it could, but now we've got the Deliveroos. You can walk out here every other, all the time now with proliferation of eateries, Deliveroos, etc., etc. Second, putting aside consumer sovereignty as a joke, given the scale of advertising campaigns and commercial pressure of vested interests against alternative, what needs to change is what is produced. As I've tried to argue, and this is what came out of this detailed product by product search, is that if you produce stuff, it'll find its way into your social diets of the country as a whole. I only ever know one instance, maybe I'm out of date, of the coordination between agricultural policy and health policy. And that was in Norway in the 1930s, but it's the exception that proved the rule, because at that time, it was assumed you should eat as much pig meat as you could and consume as much dairy products as you could. So actually, they say, oh, we must expand bacon and creameries. Otherwise, by and large, agricultural and food industry interests have always prevailed over healthy eating policy. But then who wants the nanny state as opposed to the cuddly corporate lambs who provide us with our daily food? And now just a couple of things have come to my attention as I undertook this research, suggesting how difficult it will be to shift these problems. They're sort of footnotes in a way. On the one hand, we now know that cells for dealing with excessive fat in the body are laid down in childhood. And that's why it's really important that children's diet should be healthy to begin with, because it's very, very hard to roll back from this. You get no more fat-dealing cells, and the fat will accumulate. This is where the sources of dietary diseases come from, around organs and the body, creating health problems. But we now know this about the cells to deal with fat from, believe it or not, Hiroshima, because it gave us plenty of data on the dating of when the cells were established within the body. So there's what do they call it? Natural experiment that allowed us to date when children get their fat dealings. And then the second thing, which has become very important, it's now known that there are receptors created in the brain once you have an unhealthy diet. Really, in a sense, it's not as serious as addiction, but it's making you inclined to continue to eat those similar types of food. And so, for the sake of argument, suppose we assume a perfectly competitive economy in some sense in which all corporate products are randomly trialed, then it's almost inevitable that poor diet will emerge, because those firms that provide it will prove successful irrespective of their merits on other criteria, including their own motivation, since there is an inbuilt natural bias towards poor diet. Fat, sugar, and salt become part of our tastes as a result of physiological processes. Okay, I spent a lot of time on food, but now I'm going to move to my second example of political economy of excess, finance. Over the past 30 or 40 years, the ratio of financial assets to GDP has risen by over 3 times, and it's still increasing and spreading. This is enough to suggest excess, in my view. Indeed, following the global financial crisis, there was a conference called of economists to discuss its implications for economics. That's why this is the one that you organized. Jim Mirrlees, Nobel Prize winner for optimal tax theory, a theory in which everyone pays their taxes. That tells you something about the realism of economists. Also responsible, by the way, for me being here today, as he recruited me from a maths department as his leading criteria for recruitment to doing postgraduate economics, although I think he may have regretted his choice in this case. He gave his talk on the virtues, on the global financial crisis, of the virtues of general equilibrium theory and why we should be using it. Someone unkindly asked him, what about finance in light of the global financial crisis? And he had a habit, I don't know if people have it going, And he said, oh, that's nothing to do with general equilibrium theory. There's just too much of it and we need to get rid of it. And of course, this is correct. If it had been any other input, not finance, any other input, it would be seen as the most disastrous example of productivity decline. You know, I don't know, if we used 3 times as much materials to make all the things in this room, we would say that's dreadful. And in fact, it would be totally dysfunctional. Who wants a table that's got 3 layers of wood on the top or plastic or whatever? We should use less inputs to produce things, not more. So we have this excess of finance, 3 times as much to produce a unit of GDP than we had before. But the financial sector has managed to suggest it has contributed to GDP by its redefinition, by the redefinition of GDP in line with what it earns, whereas previously finance was seen as a transfer. It was not a contributor to GDP. It produces now, we're told, financial services such as trading in risk, i.e., nothing other than the creation of more need for what is not needed. Too much finance. This, by the way, was all done in order to deregulate US domestic and overseas finance, for which some rationale of producing and exporting something had to be made. So how do you do that? Well, we produce GDP with our financial services, or we are trading in risk. In my view, this is something like finance taking 25% or so of what we produce, adding it to GDP, so we get 125% GDP, and claiming to contribute, because 25% is 20% of 125, we contributed 20% to GDP. It's as if a thief claimed to contribute to GDP through promoting the expansion in the criminal justice system that it induces. And no doubt they're correct, given the level of lawyers' fees to defend them and the clogging up in the courts, etc., etc. So across the social sciences, the rise of finance has given rise to a huge literature under the rubric of financialization, this new trendy word, well, it's sort of almost 20 years now. The major exception where financialization never appears, I'm sure you're going to tell me I'm wrong, and maybe there's been some recent example, is in the discipline where it's most needed, and that is economics. What the literature shows, and generally seeks to show, is that financialization is associated with all of the bad things in the world. That there is empirical evidence on a gargantuan scale to support this view is hardly surprising, especially if we are inclined to see correlation as causation, or at least guilt by association, because we've had this big increase 3 times of finance over the last 30 or 40 years, and we've had this increase of terrible things over the last 40 years. So of course one caused the other. Precisely because of the GFC, the general, if uneven slowdown since the end of the post-war boom, the emergence of neoliberalism, the rise of finance, the declines in growth, investment, productivities, wages, growing inequality, austerity policies, decline in democratic values, social welfare, the level and quality of infrastructure, they're all to be blamed on this excess of financialization. And I also tend to say it should be observed that these negative indicators of performance have arisen despite what might be thought to be the most favorable conditions for capitalism. What are they? The rise of China as an economic power and its contributions of millions to the world global labor force. alongside the rising and increasing participation of women in the labour market. So, you couldn't have, capitalism couldn't have asked for more increase in the supply and the amount of labour there. The unprecedented series of technological innovations that we've had, not just AI and everything, biological, incredible increase in technological, the decline in the strength and influence of trade unions and progressive movements around. Neoliberalism won, all right? So, the end of the Cold War, the rise of neoliberalism. I remember Ted Heath complaining bitterly, saying, "You capitalists, I gave you everything you wanted, and still you didn't invest." And that's what's happened in the world. What the hell is going on? I do believe a major part of the answer is to be found in financialization, and that it is responsible for many of these baddies. So we all know how financialization has become excessive. Any stream of revenue can be securitized into an asset that itself becomes bundled up with others, new financial markets created, and assets traded with an increasingly distant relationship to the stream of real activities that supposedly underpin them. Correspondingly, we get all of the negative features of the neoliberal period within individual countries and globally. But here, I want to air a word of caution. So extensive, wide-ranging, and deep have been the negative consequences of financialization that they are taken to be general and uniform. And I think that is a mistake. I would suggest otherwise. We really have to fill out the mechanisms by which the growth of finance is or is not attached to consequences alongside its own determinants and the role of other factors. From this, I draw the conclusion that the political economy of excess, as far as finance is concerned, is marked by, it's a nice trendy word, variegated levels of incidence across countries and sectors, and with variegated effects and responses. In particular, speculative expansion of finance is not necessarily self-confining, but can be attached to what might be termed real accumulation, not the curtailment of accumulation. We have already met an example, food, for example, for which we have this huge excessive production, which does not originate with financialization, but has been intensified by it. Financialization of food has led to massive increases in supply, not shortages. And this is part of my third example of the political economy of excess, the environment in all of its aspects. I claim no expertise in this area, or numbers of areas ranging from climate change to endangered species, but we cannot both have that financialization dulls the levels of investment and that it remorselessly promotes fossil fuel production and consumption, with a neat paradox, of course, of greening energy also being heavily associated with continuing use of fossil fuels through offsets. Financialization through securitization of assets does and inevitably ultimately depend upon revenues that correspond to both production and consumption, even if also generating rewards purely within finance that do neither. Last and by no means least, on the political economy of excess, let me point to the intimate connection between all of those three case studies I brought together: the excesses of food, the excesses in finance, and the excesses in energy and climate change are all related to one another in the way that capitalism has functioned over the recent period. So let me end by asking what is to be done. My starting point is depressing to some degree, because in my view, it is not a matter of promoting alternative ways of thinking and corresponding alternative policies. These are already well known. Although I do not dismiss the power of a necessity for putting forward alternative. As Merle's put it, nothing to do with general equilibrium theory, but there's too much finance. We all know that. Don't we all know that? As climate science puts it, too much energy. We all know that. When people say, oh, academia, especially economists, have this huge influence over policy, and so I said, no, they don't. No. Look at climate science. What have they done? Nothing. Look at what's the golden academic standard for welfare? Scandinavia, right? Scandinavia. Is that what we're getting? No. So you have to look very, very carefully at the ways in which scholarship actually, it's not simple the way that scholarship does or does not feed into policy makings. As I said, climate science put it, too much energy. As dietitians put it, too much food, too poorly distributed in consumption. What we do need is to build progressive movements to bring about alternative policies that go beyond the immediate outcomes to root causes in the systems of production and how they feed into excesses in particular forms. I also actually, just to go back to the food example, this is something that I wrote about. There is a theory about the reason why we eat so poorly is because we don't know anything about our food, because it's so far, we don't work the fields and we don't know what's coming into our food, how it's being grown, etc., etc., etc. This is called the omnivore's paradox. Whereas I said, put something for all the time. I said, actually, we know, even the child in school knows much, much more about food and its content. People 200 years ago didn't know what a vitamin was. They didn't know anything about. So the problem isn't that we don't know what is healthy eating. Of course we know what is healthy eating. So it's not about knowledge. It's about what is produced and how. I am not optimistic about prospects, as we have now suffered 50 years of neoliberalism, 50 years, far more than its Keynesian predecessor. And neoliberalism is marked, even underpinned, by the hollowing out of progressive participation in policy making, but not the hollowing out of the state. The neoliberal state is extremely interventionist, despite its ideology to the contrary. Rather, state power has been centralized and heavily geared towards the promotion of financialization, with politics itself increasingly subject to the swings and roundabouts of populism, with social media rather than democratic participation as a driving force. In general, this has advantaged the right, especially the extreme right, with at most sporadic and insecure success for more progressive movements. In short, I've argued that neoliberalism as the contemporary stage of capitalism is defined by, but not reducible to, the excessive role of financialization. Shock therapy, to begin with, it's gone through 3 phases. Shock therapy to begin with, third wayism, continue with financialization, but ameliorate some of the worst excesses. And the current phase in which there is extensive intervention to support the private finances support for industrial production or otherwise. Of the dysfunctional fallouts, the most obvious example was the global financial crisis, which was aptly described as socialism for the bankers and capitalism for the rest of us. Bear in mind that funding to rescue finance during the global financial crisis exceeded all the revenues ever raised by all privatizations ever across the world. And yet we have to privatize in order to allow finance to allocate resources and allow enterprises to function efficiently. The new phase of neoliberalism intensifies its overt ideological contradictions. The state's power and resources are used to promote the interests of private finance in its support for investments because the state is incapable of doing it itself. It really puts people before profit on the analytical agenda. Whether it can be put on the policy agenda is another matter. First and foremost, though, we have to get behind the power of finance before we could even begin to consider alternatives. I'm not sure, actually I wrote I am sure, but for what you said, I'm not sure that Thomas Hodgkin would have approved the quote from Sir Baron Josiah Stamp, which became my favorite around the global financial crisis. Stamp was the founder of ICI, a member of the board of the Bank of England, an expert on tax, and reputedly the second richest individual in the UK in the 1930s. His death was also interesting, but that's another digression, which I could tell you over a drink. Banking, here it is. Oh, I can't put it. Banking was conceived in iniquity and was born in sin. The bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create deposits, and with a flick of the pen, they will create enough deposits to buy it back again. However, take it away from them, and all the great fortunes like mine will disappear, and they ought to disappear, for this would be a happier and better world to live in. But if you wish to remain the slaves of the bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create deposits. Same as Jim Murley's, really, but a little bit more eloquent. Brilliant as far as it goes for someone in an ideal position to know. So as it were, stamp on or out the bankers as the first step in being able to begin thinking, let alone putting into practice a happier and better world, dealing with excesses as well as deficits as two sides of the same coinage of contemporary capitalism. There we go. Thank you.
Okay. We have time for questions.
So what's the alternative? So communism didn't exactly give you a healthy diet.
Ah,
Well, the Chinese diet under communism was probably healthier
Oh,
than one they have